Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the status of the Malazan Empire. And we are finally in House of Chains, Volume 4 of those 10 very big books. And today we're going to talk about the first part of the first book. The first book is called Faces in the Rock, and we're going to talk about that some more in a minute. But first, the obligatory look at the cape. We have reached the point where this is basically impossible for me to show because it's growing and it's growing and it's growing. Basically, it goes down to almost to my knees at this point, which means we're getting close to the point where I need to figure out how to do the cowl and everything. So I have an idea, and it's probably wrong. So in a couple of days, you'll all be able to laugh at my stupidity. Won't that be fun, right? See, I do everything for your entertainment. But now let's get into House of Chains, Faces in the Rock. Cheers. All right. Well, first of all, a quick look at the what's it called? The prologue, where we meet someone called Tral Sengar and his brothers, and he's being shown, whatever that means. Well, I mean, we kind of know what it means. He's gonna be cast out from his family. It's explained, and he's in the nascent, that weird realm we've met before that was flooded. You remember in Deadhouse Gates, that realm where Sylanda is, where Heboric and all the others meet Gessler and the Sylanda for a time? Yep, that realm again. We still don't know why it is flooded and everything, and we don't even know who Troll Sengar is. It basically ends with that whole idea of balance being out of kilter. Also, if we look at the timeline, but the date of the prologue, we're once again a couple of years back. A lot of these things are happening all at the same time. Once again, the same is happening with book 1 of House of Chains, as we well know, because this must be roughly around the time Gardens of the Moon starts, because at some point it's mentioned that that the Siege of Pale is still ongoing with the Malazans. So what does that tell us? It tells us once again that the overall narrative of the Malazan Book of the Fallen is not a continuous book 1, like volume 1 leads into volume 2, leads into volume 3, leads into volume 4, and so forth. It's rather a bit more complicated. So basically we have several books that sort of start at the same time, which will be book 1 and book 4. And then we have book 2 and book 3, like volumes 2 and 3 that happen at the same time. But, I mean, we're not going to go into how long House of Chains will actually take, like how far that will go into the future. Anyway, I want to talk about the first half of Faces in the Rock. That means chapter 1 and 2. That's more than half of chapter 1 of book 1. Actually, it's more like 2/3 of it, I think. Not calculating correctly here. And so if you're looking like, if you're afraid of spoilers and have not yet finished book 2, not book 2, chapter 2, then yeah, there might be spoilers in here. Anyway, so what happens so far? We see our good friend Karsa Orlong, who is, I am told, a favorite of a lot of fans. He's not exactly a favorite of mine, but he's certainly an interesting character. We see him, basically we follow him and his 2 companions, Bayroth and Delum, I think. That's their names. Whatever. Once again, I probably fuck up the pronunciation. I'm on the audiobooks, obviously. And the biggest problem is that now with book 4, well, with House of Chains, the narrator has changed. So some of the stuff is going to be pronounced differently from now on. And I'm like, I don't know what's correct. And frankly, I don't care. It really isn't too important to me if someone pronounces a name correctly or not. I'm just going to say that what's his name, Michael Page, saying Soletaken instead of Soltaken really pisses me off, because I feel Soltaken in and Divers sounds more closer to the meaning of what happens when they change form, but never mind. That's not what what we're going to talk about here today. There's a bunch of interesting things happening though in this book. Well, first of all, there is something that kind of struck me as a weird contradiction. So maybe it's an editing error or something. But there's the following situation, and like when Bayroth and Karsa are arguing, Bayroth tells Karsa that he has been Dali's lover for a while, and so forth. And Karsa then says, I will not marry her, I will make her my slave. And then later on it's said that in their legend, the Tablor know that in the legends of the Tablor, it's mentioned that they used to have slaves. Now it is possible that Karsa, being a very traditionally minded Tablor at this point, was thinking about resurrecting the custom to insult Bayroth, or it's an editing error, and like in an earlier stage there was still like Stephen Erickson didn't actually think about the question whether Tablor have slaves or not at this point, and then later on, yeah, that's where the inconsistency comes from. Anyway, I'm not gonna poke holes into that. It just popped into my mind when I was reading it today. So ignore it if you can, or interpret it the way you want to interpret it. All right. What else? World building. Once again, there's a lot of world building and world information going on here that we will look at from time to time. I just wanted to, also drop in the idea that there's another nom, and keep that name in mind. Noms are ubiquitous in the Malazan world. This one is Torvald Nom, and Karsa meets him for the first time, and we don't know yet if we know that he is related, but we don't know in which way he is related to our good friend Ralik Nom, who is still sleeping on Ganoas Paran's doorstep since he moved into the house, the Azath house in Darujistan. So anyway, that's not what I wanted to talk about mostly. So the overarching theme of this first volume, or at least the first part of this first book, is the whole concept of civilization and barbarism once again. Remember, like yesterday, I think, actually yesterday I talked about that, or the day before, that conversation between Humble Thor and Whiskey Jack about how civilization, how the Malazans would take over the Barghast after a while. Well, it turns out we now see some elements of that in that interview that Karsa has with the Sunid Tablor in that slave pit. Ain't it just? Okay, but let's start from the beginning. What we see in the beginning is the Tablor being, and it's interesting that we see all of this from Karsa's point of view. From a rather traditionally minded, ambitious Tablor, who seems to be rather stupid, or at least rather oblivious to things around himself. He's rather full of himself. He's extremely egotistically minded. He apparently completely because of his whole manly behavior, ignores like the fact that his cousin, probably cousin, I think cousin Bayroth is already sleeping with his with the girl he wants to woo, not woo. You know what I mean? Wooing, yeah. With the girl he wants to woo. He doesn't realize all these things because he's so full of himself and so full of being a very traditionally minded manly tableau, and that shows us already a lot of things because Bayroth is much smarter in a way, as seems to be our good friend, not our good friend Karsa's dad, because we have this weird dynamic with his grandfather and his father, where the grandfather is or claims to be this tableau hero, and the father being rather skeptical of those traditions, and Karsa in his like adolescence, I would say. I mean, yeah, he's considered to be adult, but just barely adult, so maybe let's just think of him being adolescent, sort of. Apparently, in his adolescence, has turned to those stories and legends of glory that his grandfather is telling, and despises his father's rather pacifist attitude. And now this is something that you obviously see a lot in all kinds of cultures that are more traditionally minded. In a way, it's like this turning to the idea of glory, this turning to the idea of very traditional virtues, and this as something to distance yourself from your direct parents, and going back to like older values. You see that in today's world, where you have these people, where you have like rather young conservative people out there. Like, I mean, I'm not sure. This is definitely more of a, if this is more of a German or a European thing or not. I'm just like, I know it from here, but you have like these people who have rather, progressive, liberal-minded parents, and suddenly their children become extremely conservative in a way. That's a trend that you have a lot of times all over the world. It's like, I don't know, look at your Ben Shapiro's with his liberal parents, and now he's like, I'm not going to go into like politics. I'm not going to, well, comment on those specific political opinions here. I'm just going to say that you have the general situation that in a lot of societies, this is like a trend or a more or less natural occurrence, that children who are in their in their efforts to sort of distance themselves from their parents, look to their grandparents' views and sometimes adopt them. And yeah, this is obviously what happens with Karsa. The other thing there with Karsa is, and there's two things about that we need to talk about in a minute. Now, obviously, throughout their descent from their mountain, from the Lateran plateau to that town at the lake, we get more and more information about the fact that all these hero stories that his grandfather tells about his glorious raid are not as true as Karsa takes them, which obviously is one of those things, like also another general thing, that hero stories, if told by those heroes, those aged, self-declared heroes, are to be taken with a grain of salt. All legends are obviously to be taken with a grain of salt, because you can look at the same thing when it comes to all kinds of, national epics and all of that stuff, like hero legends, whether it's like on the grand scheme in literature, or even like, your grandfather's grandparents' war stories, and like let's yeah, let's try not to get too political, but there is this thing that within Germany, it's basically like everyone nowadays, almost everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people claim that their grandparents were obviously no Nazis and did not do anything. And like everyone has at least one resistance fighter or in their family, which is obviously bullshit. But it's something that is important for like a lot of things. And there's this sort of quote which maybe never was actually uttered by an historian. It's a French historian from the 19th century, and I can't remember his name, but the quote is like, lying about its past is one of the things that makes a nation. And this goes also to the, like, the smaller level, like the family level as well. So we have that going on in that Polk cynic Karsa dynamic, and it's going to be interesting to see how Karsa for now is very good at ignoring all those doubts and just pushing them aside. That's like the other thing about Karsa, is he's extremely single-minded. He's extremely single-minded. And one of those things, I made a video about that, but I don't want to go into that because that one is probably more spoilery. So far, a lot of the things Karsa wants to do, no matter how ridiculous, how brutal, or whatever they are, he is very good at just enforcing his willpower and enforcing his will on the world. And we see that on his descent. They go down, they just take over that village and rape everybody and so forth. And holy shit, is Karsa Orlong an asshole, and seems to get away with it almost all the time. Well, I mean, he's apparently a giant. He's a very good fighter. That's on his side, but still, you have that situation there that I feel is kind of interesting to look at the dynamic there, because in a lot of like more edifying tales, you would see people like that getting their comeuppance rather sooner than later. And yes, at the end of chapter 2, it looks like he has finally been, or at least for now, being caught and so forth. But until then, he gets away with a lot of stuff. All right. So the other thing there is and this is what I find interesting. There's this small situation when those 7 faces from the rock, who are apparently no gods whatsoever, but we already, I guess, it won't come as much of a surprise to say that they look like Talani Mas and seem to be Talani Mas, that the Teblor pray to. That when they discuss what to do if Karsa fails, and that they are preparing now Bayroth's daughter to be like already. And the interesting thing there is, and that's something like a question that we won't really find out, is how much of because I keep forgetting the name of that face in the, like, that Talani Mas, that broken one, whatever you're going to call them, who said like the body is female, but what I make of her is neither a man nor a woman, or something like that. And the question is, how much of that did happen to Karsa Orlong? So how much of that is like, how much of his actions are actually like his own? How much of that is already being guided by this outside force? And that's like an interesting dynamic, because it kind of dampens the criticism, the innate criticism of tradition and religion that you could also read into the whole setup there. It's like people be like their religion, their faith being manipulated to a certain end, and the fact that once again that those beings seem to have power, and we basically already know where that power comes from, right? Kind of offsets that criticism, or makes it a bit more difficult to just straight take that criticism from the Malazan world into our own world and our own behavior when it comes to religion. But it definitely shows that tradition, just because of traditions, can be extremely vicious and brutal. Like, there's this like idea that once again you have this idea of the noble savage, and those people living in these tribal structures far away from civilization, with their like handed down ideas or traditions and way of life for hundreds of years or thousands of years or whatever. And there's this like romanticization or what? Romanticization. I am stupid. I don't know that word. Anyway, it's romanticized by a lot of people. People, this kind of traditional lifestyle and what have you. And nope. It's very, I don't want to say nasty, brutish, and short, because obviously Teblor lived for hundreds of years, but it's definitely brutal, at least very brutal, and not what you and I would call humane or morally sound or whatever, or ethically correct. And that's something to keep in mind there. It's like, and the way that Erikson handles this here is just really well done, because over their way down, their descent from this like mountain, like this plateau into the lowlands, we get like hints and glimpses of the fact that their like belief system and their worldview seems to be somewhat problematic. And then when they encounter civilization there at Silver Lake, it's not a shining, it's not the shining city on the hill either, is it? I mean, it's their slavery. The other Teblor have been enslaved, or treated cruelly by the people there, and so forth. It also sucks, like everything sucks, or is at least problematic. And that's another thing in there that the Malazan series overall does. It's like there is no clear, there's neither the clear superiority of civilization, moral superiority of civilization, or the clear moral superiority of a more barbaric traditional lifestyle. They both have problems and they both suck, because what it boils down to is what you as a human being, as an individual, do, as we have spoken about before, right? So this is done really well. Another thing there is the whole like idea, like the overall picture or image or metaphor that the Teblor descend into the valley of civilization down there. It's like their whole way is like they descend into more brutality and brutality and brutality, getting more and more brutal, and all the way down the hill and so forth, and lose sort of the innocence of their like tribal existence while they are going down into the city. You could read it that way. Then you have that great image of that stair of bones, what they call the Pass of Bones, and what apparently the Nathi in that city called Tilan Pass, because obviously those are Tilan Amas. That's just interesting. Another thing that stuck out to me, one of those sentences that I just love, because the sad irony in that, when they are in that, I'm rambling, aren't I? I'm rambling. Anyway, okay, so quick thing. So when they are in that cave and read those that account of that unnamed old Teblor who sort of created the tribes and all of that stuff, and he quotes Icarium, and says and Icarium has apparently said that only through forgetting can they live. And I'm just like, I mean, we're talking Icarium here, right? Who basically forgets all his cruelty and past, like not cruelty, but all his past atrocities. He just forgets them and wakes up again and doesn't remember them. And basically he unwittingly, and that's the sad irony there, the really sad irony there, is that he obviously doesn't know that this happens to him, but he says that the Teblor, whatever they happened to do before, and we don't know what that was at this point, but apparently they need to forget all of that stuff, all of their obviously higher civilization or whatever they had. They in order to survive, they need to forget all of that and need to focus on their really old legends. Yeah, I just found that sadly ironic, that quote of Icarium's. Well, I do feel some affinity with Icarium in general, so that, I don't know, that just struck me. And obviously you have that amazing picture of the way of bones that they're descending. They're descending on a trail of bones, and even, and Bayroth even makes like a short mention of that being rather symbolic. Like, once again, this idea that there's a lot of symbolism within the Malazan book, but most of the time Erikson kind of offsets that or makes it appear less heavy-handed by sort of showing it up on like a meta level, which I just really enjoy. In general, the whole debates, the arguments between Karsa and Bayroth are just extremely well done. And I feel there's so much just in those dialogues between Bayroth and Karsa, and I'm going to miss or forget most of it. Yeah, I kind of already forgot most of it again, I guess, and I kind of miss most points when I'm talking about it now. But one of the things I found interesting is, like, clearly Bayroth is the much more cynical, the much smarter, let's not say smarter, but the much more cynical, world-wise, realistic one of the two. But he makes a huge mistake in there, right? He makes a huge mistake because it looks like he believes that because he thinks of himself as smarter as Karsa, he could basically steer things and like talk himself and talk circles and think circles around Karsa. And there's this one point where Karsa really clearly shows up, and when we can basically see how Bayroth realizes that that doesn't work, because Karsa is such a force of nature that all attempts to sort of rein him in will fail. And that's a very poignant warning against arrogance for those of us who think of themselves as smart. Beware that beware, it makes it so easy to underestimate other people, and that's one of those things I found in there. And then obviously the whole realization that Bayroth has much earlier that that a lot of the worldview of the Teblor is apparently constructed and there's a lot of stuff going on that they don't know. And I just love the fact that we get like the small hints drop that obviously they are larger than everyone else. And obviously they are also much more long-lived than everyone else. And we kind of get all those hints all the time. We know that Karsa is 80 years old, considered a just adult since like 1 year. But it takes until like the last minute before they actually round that shoulder rock and see that there's no longer just like a farm, but like an entire city, like a town. It takes like until that moment, until when Bayroth just said like, so how many generations would that be for those lowlander children? And I find it just like well done, because while we're in Karsa's viewpoint there, we don't think about that. And even though Bayroth says that like shortly before, it's still kind of, when you read it for the first time, it still comes like as something of a shock when there's like no longer a farm but like an entire city, entire town, and then they still just tear in there and just destroy and slaughter so many people. Like the pure violence in there is just brutal. And yeah, the whole idea of this force of nature still being kind of reined in by civilization, by the Malazans, and obviously the slave master as well. And we get shown that civilization is as bad or maybe even worse as the sheer animal ferocity of the Teblor. So that is all just done masterfully, and we'll see what happens now in the next, like, not tomorrow, tomorrow's Saturday. I'll be back with a video about House of Chains on Monday, so we'll talk about what happens now with our good friend Karsa in the hands of the Malazans. We'll do that on Monday, and yeah, that's going to be interesting to look at. So yeah, I think I'm gonna wrap it up with this for today, and I'll talk to you about House of Chains on Monday. Tomorrow there will be something else, and on Sunday there will be something else. And we'll see how much further I progress with the cape until Monday, and then maybe I can already show you failure or something. Anyway, until then, have a great Friday, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Cheers.